So I have the pleasure now to introduce you to some issues from a social science perspective. And before I start, maybe I would like to take you on board of my sort of reasoning. So just to get you into, let's say, the line of thoughts, and let's see how this works. So why would we take the challenge to talk to each other and have social science in such a complex system like aquaculture and circular economy, gain, and so forth? I think very simply put, we're living now in the Anthropocene. We have unfortunately heard a lot of news over the last months on all these climate extremes everywhere. And I think there's not much denial that the human agency, all of us are somewhat becoming a main driver in the planetary evolution. So the social and ecological interactions we all face are no longer local and regional, but apparently global. And so things what we do as humankind have some direct Earth system responses. And this is, of course, also true for the marine realm. And you saw just in these nice figures from Richard before that it's a very contested place we're living, and especially the sea space, because all the goods and services are mostly transported over the sea areas. And I think very often, more often than not, we tend to forget that we're living on a blue planet, and that this blue planet supports half of the oxygen we breathe every day, and is a very, very important part in food provision, especially for low-income countries. So having said that, and having sort of this very broad dimensional view, obviously we need to transform. And there's a transformational challenge we have. That is, how can we tackle climate change and at the same time have blue growth? I personally have to admit, this is now a little side thing, that I don't like the term blue growth because it implies that we grow, but somehow, you know, we're flying like with an airplane and nobody's telling us how to land again. And so I think this is already subconsciously, if you say blue growth, it could be contested here. Okay, so that said, what we would like to do is in the future, if we want to land the plane in aquaculture, it would be nice to have, of course, low carbon sources and more circular ways of producing food. And this is just a number that we could actually, by smart farming, we could actually reduce our CO2 imprint. So the marine aquaculture, therefore, has a quite large role to play in nutritional seafood and food security, and especially in areas where fish stocks are forecast to decline. I've spent over 10 years in Brazil and at the Amazon, and a long time in Indonesia. And I think this is really, if once you have, I had the fortune to experience that, you know, if you talk about nutritional seafood, it's really a matter. And especially in Western countries like in the EU, often things are forgotten that that is a really central issue we're talking about. So having said that, we really need some pragmatic, bold solutions. And these entail about governance, technology, finance. And so basically what we're calling for, or what we are challenged, all of us, is to think about how can we create new partnerships between humanity and our oceans. So basically the triple P, protect, produce, and prosper. And all, of course, in line with our global normative rules and agreements, so that the sustainability goals, the SDGs, which they hope, while formulating them on this EU level, UN level, they hope to create a better future for us all while addressing food security. So coming then to food security, what is the triple burden of that? So food security is not solely only about, yeah, I produce a fish and done, but it's more also about what nutritional value does it have? So utilization, what social value do we have? Like, do we really care for this? And is it safe? But at the same time, it's also an issue about food access. So can people afford to buy this product? Can they allocate it? And do they actually like it? And then the third part is about availability. And that's something you heard a lot in this last hours and days about production, distribution, and exchange. And on top of that, we have the triple burden of food. That is undernutrition, but also micronutrient deficiencies or overnutrition. So there's quite a lot of different dimensions when we simply say the word food security. And I leave you with that, but I just wanted to point that out, that it is not that easy when we talk about it. So coming then to aquaculture as a central role in food security, or as an actor of transformative food security, somehow at the moment in time, we're experiencing what I always say, a marine Neolithic revolution. So basically a blue revolution. Neolithic is a situation where humankind for the first time has actually ended up cultivating something. So we say Neolithic development when hunters and gatherers ended up settling somewhere and harvesting, deliberately planting and harvesting something. So in a way, we're right here, we are there. And just a nice figure from Duarte and colleagues, where you see on the left-hand side land animals, so 10,000 before present. So we've have quite a good experience on what we're doing on our terrestrial regions, but we're, as you see on the right-hand side, we're not that well knowledgeable so far, I would say, with how to cultivate marine systems or marine animals, so to say. So it's roughly the last 80 years. So having just identified that, then the question from my stance is, so how can we actually then capture socioeconomic effects, and what newness does actually emerge if we have something so new to us? From a human lifetime expectancy, it might be a bit odd to say this is really new and novel, but it is, because it has to do something with how do we interact between people, food, and what is the meaning making of that. So from a science perspective then, there's a quite strong hidden dilemma, if we look on it that way, between people, food, and meaning. Why is that? So it relates to the donkey dilemma. I always say donkey dilemma. This is now very, very straightforward and very simple. But and I'm overstretching it here, and I know that it is not so straightforward. But simply put, from a natural science view, you will say that nature is the interesting part, so it's highly dynamic, and you're like, wow, this is really cool. And society is sort of like a straight line. What is this? So then from a social science point of view, so my point, I would say, oh, wow, society is so interesting. You know, we talk every day, and I always get these new ideas. And nature, yeah, it's raining or it's not raining, but it's, you know, something. Okay, so in a way, if we then say, yes, we're now here and we want to transform, and then we're in a way in a negotiation process between these very, very different worldviews. So this is the donkey dilemma. Obviously, we're tied together, and we need to somewhat negotiate. So what haystack are we covering first, basically, and what is second, and how do we actually work together? So this is basically the challenge we are facing. And Because my background is philosophy, I'm very much interested in epistemology, meaning how do we actually produce knowledge? And I wanted to show you then more in depth, what does it mean if you're rather leaning to the natural science or the social science? So looking at the theory, looking at the research goals, and looking at the method. So from a natural science point of view, most of it could be linked to the philosophical theory of positivism. That is, that you say that all knowledge, what we get, is derived by experience, and it's interpreted by universal natural laws. So basically, the theoretical question we're asking when we're trying to investigate something is how objective research methods capture the reality. And then the goal is to find out universal laws which explain what I have captured. And mostly you do numerical statistics, classifications, and then you generalize. So from my point of view, then it's more the constructivism. So saying that we gain knowledge by learning, and that each one of us sort of is reconstructing its knowledge on an everyday basis. And probably you all know that when you were a child, then when a plate was hot or not hot, or that a hill goes down, that you have to walk differently, you learn that. And then, so that's basically this constructive, subjective, situated knowledge, basically. And so what I always ask is, how is reality socially constructed? And how actually cultural and the situational settings shape my reality? And because I'm quite sure that you all have experienced that you have been going out in a group with young other people, and then you say, oh, this is cool, and the other says, oh, this is really horrible. So apparently there's, there are gaps of perception and then constructing. So basically what I always then do is more, the methods is more context specific, analytic, and in-depth understanding, which is from my social and natural science colleagues, they sometimes always say I'm a little like a fluffy dog. You never know where's the point and where's the front, because it's all somewhere there. However, now the good news is that we actually have common themes, and we're not that far apart as we always think we are. So basically, no matter where you are situated in this, it's always a matter of empirical data. Without empirical data, nothing can be done and proven. And we all want to produce knowledge. And we all want to produce knowledge in a standard and objective manner. And we want to test and formulate hypotheses. And so I think if we remember that, so in the future, if you talk to other people, then please have that in mind. We are not that far away from each other, the royal we, yeah? So here again, run in a bracket. So then, having then now the answers is, I think we need to, I would propose that we should be agreeing on that resource use is a social practice, and it has some relationships with individual and a communal sense of understanding of norms and values and rules of use. So why are you doing that? It can be very different in whatever context you are. And it's always very highly negotiated over time. So having said that, it's quite important for us, as in aquaculture especially, to understand the relationship between the different users, and that they have different norms and values on which they operate and make decisions. And therefore, I strongly propose that we need to focus much stronger on the role of communication to clarify our underlying assumptions, to understand the networks, and especially to understand the culture. And also then to recognize that decisions are not made clear-cut, but they are always somewhat in a co-evolutionary way between different stakeholder groups in a given system. So then, from a social perspective, so what does it mean then for aquaculture? Apparently, we're right now in a phase where we would say we're phasing out of conventional ways of getting fish or getting marine resources, and we're phasing into something new. And it's somewhat has related to a change or a development of our brains. It's sort of that we're shifting our mindset to more, I would say narratives of modernity. So narratives are stories, and I'm quite sure that you all would agree with me, I hope at least, that people are somewhat story-loving animals, and they always are happy to have a nice story told. And that can be very differently done, but I think a case in point is the rise of Netflix or all these videos and cinema productions. It's a type of a narrative storytelling and meaning making of life. So apparently with aquaculture, we're in the middle of this shifting mindset. And to accelerate that, to new conscious developments, we need structural interventions. That means that we need to think of new ways of how to incentivize systems that they are more sustainable, to make more future-oriented policies, to develop new regulations, etc. And all of this cannot happen out of the blue, but it's a collaborative effort. And because it all, at the end of the day, will deal with us all. So we need to think of new forms of governance in that. So coming then to this need for transformation, especially what you've heard already earlier about different products being included in aquaculture development. Obviously, there are new technologies involved. And most interestingly, they're always somewhat perceived as a degradation to nature. However, on the positive tone, there's also, because we're talking about it and we're discussing on what could we actually change and how could we change it, it's a way of how can we, what is a value for us? So what do we cherish most, and how what is most important? So it's in a way quite interesting time we're in right now to discuss what is really important to us as an individual or as a group or as a meaning making. And this very often is not so clear cut, but it's very soft, so somewhat intangible. Because the way how we cultivate aquaculture, for example, affects also the way how we perceive a marine as a common good to us all. And from that, we need to identify the more subtle changes, what is happening, so the day-to-day dealings. For example, my favorite example is the way we changed appointments since we have the mobile phone. When I grew up, long time ago, I was in this nice analogous setting where I would meet a friend and then I would say, let's meet again. Okay, let's say in 2 days' time at 3 o'clock in the cafe. And then you would go there and then you would wait. And if you were lucky, the friend didn't forget you. Or if you had bad fortune, you just drank a coffee on your own and then you went home again. And nowadays, if you have your mobile phone, you're quite quick on meeting and saying, I'm late, wait, and your entire system has changed. And I think this is more a significant change than we very often perceive. Well, at least in my view, I'm no longer that patient as before. Oh, well, okay. So having said that, I'm revealing here myself. Aquaculture has a lot of phases, apparently, and dimensions. And then so when we talk about changing aquaculture to more circularity, then we need to ask a lot of questions. So for whom? to what extent, of what, by whom, how, and what would be affected. So the 10 questions we were addressing in the GAIN project was really how do we capture social dimensions, and how do we merge them in somewhat a meaningful way, and how do we get actually contacts across different countries? I remember then when Richard was talking, there was a question about, yeah, what about Africa? And so, you know, that's already quite difficult then to get some more generics and some more specifics. How do we do that? So now I'd like to show you some data. Probably you heard this one before, just seeing how the EU production is relative to the world. So basically the EU production is going down and the EU doesn't have a very nice high self-sufficiency rate. So apparently then, if you forecast into the future, the aquaculture for Europe, at least, and for European food security will be rising in importance. And somehow this sort of links nicely that there is an observable gap of knowledge on aquaculture among the average consumers. So we then, observing that, what we did in the GAIN was that we looked on more depth, what is actually the public acceptance of aquaculture? We found that from the statistics and data available so far, there's quite a notable gap that more seafood will be demanded for in the EU. Like, for example, sushi has gained quite a significant rise in popularity over the last 15 years. And interestingly enough, however, not surprisingly, there's a highly contested social acceptance issue of aquaculture in the EU. And despite that this aquaculture market share is growing, still the issue is very negative. And because of that, the social license to operate is somewhat reduced. Having now introduced these two words or concepts, social license to operate and social acceptability, I'm not quite sure if you know the difference. Is anybody aware that thumbs up who knows that there is a difference? I just need some backup here. Okay, are you aware of the differences? Okay. For those who are not, the social license to operate is focused on the private sector. It's a company matter. So it's very much an issue about how does the company communicate, and it looks very much into detail. What best practices can we derive from the private sector to be better accepted in a given area? And it doesn't really require a formal institutional process to guide that exchange, but it's simply a matter, again, of context and who is talking to whom, how is the cultural setting, etc. So achieving a good social license to operate is apparently then an outcome of a successful exchange between the company and the public, and ideally at multiple geographical levels. So this is one. So social acceptability is something much more broader. It's a society at large, and it's a collective community-based evaluation, and it sort of also fosters the implementation of certain governance processes, and is based on deliberation and public involvement. So somewhat linking, if you remember my food security table, so that people need to have a discourse on do we really need this food, and in what ways do we want to have it, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And then you get a social acceptability. And having that, then obviously this leads then to a more nicer way of getting a social license. So basically, social acceptability is a social construction, and it's based on a trade-offs between the pros and cons. And I hope you got this separation, because I think that's something a lot of times people end up mixing. And then you always talk about, we need a social license to operate, but actually you also need the social acceptance and the governance setting before you actually can get to the social license. Okay, so then if you want to look at social acceptability, obviously you need to have some knowledge before you can make a decision. And then we looked into the GAIN project within the GAIN, how or does prior knowledge drive consumers' choice? So if I know more from the onset, will I be more ready to use and consume seafood and aquaculture, and will I be open for change? So most of the time, obviously, you all know that consumers' attitudes is very personal. You have a personal value why you like a matter or not, and then you also have on a very individual way perceived barriers, and whether you also accept the information you receive, and if you are confident that it is a good information. And most of the time, consumers are rather uninformed about aquaculture, especially in regard to environmental health and quality. And that sort of relates then to the socioeconomic interests and decision making, because it very much links to the moral standard you have, the emotional and the personal values you entail with a certain product. And that all sort of then affects how the public as large perceives aquaculture in a different context. For example, we found out for the EU that ecology-oriented young females, or females and young consumers are more likely to shift to meat-reduced vegetarian vegan lifestyles in Western countries. And I wonder why that is. So we have some males here. So I guess it's more this sort of subconscious still, I'm a hunter-gatherer and I need a piece of meat on my plate. I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with that. Okay. And because young age people or students are not so consolidated in their views as such, or we then argued for that this would be an interesting group to work with to advance how can we look at the information and information sharing. And then we looked also on the social factors, how that drive seafood consumption behavior and the attitudes. So just to show you quickly the target audiences, what we did, we looked on well-educated public in Germany. Then we looked at young researchers. We looked at aquaculture research experts. We looked at students, supermarket sector, so basically the broad public, and the tourism sector. And here's just sort of what we did. We did poster surveys, interviews, snowball sampling, and ex ante and ex post. And you were subject to an ex ante ex post as well. And I will come to your results in a minute. Just to keep up the excitement here at midday. Okay, so just to show you an example of a poster survey on the right-hand side. So we took the 3 central species of the GAIN project, and then we asked them what fish would they like most. And here I cannot cannot stress more strongly that you really need to revisit your assumptions and pre-test any type of survey, because I started with this poster and I just had these nice fish, And then I had the boxes, please tick, and done. And then I asked my fellow friends who are not part of the marine research realm, and they were saying, okay, so this upper fish, so this is a salmon, and well, how does it look like? So I ended up having, as you see it on the poster, the fish already prepared and cooked, so that people would recognize that. And that's something, you know, that where you have your preset mindset and you don't really realize that apparently other people might have problems following. And then also, a lot of people said they don't like any type of fish. So I need to have another box in there included saying, yes, if you don't like fish, what else do you eat? So just to showcase you, this is a very simple example of that you definitely need to revisit your assumptions really carefully. And we did a lot of other methods here. Maybe the semi-structured interviews is maybe a wording you may not have been familiar with before. So semi-structured interviews is a method where you have some central questions, but you want to get the context right. So you want to know, for example, if a fish farmer somewhere in Nigeria has access to a fridge, then you don't say, do you have access to a fridge? But you sort of end up having first a conversation, and then you end up getting there. And so and by this conversation, you learn a lot of other things as well. So that's why semi-structured interviews is the buzzword for this type of method. So just to show you then some of the examples, we had a sea bream, salmon, and trout, and we asked the participants of the survey. This is now just a little snapshot. What type of fish do they like? And the blue bars are the aquaculture expert group, and the green bars are the young academics, so 20 odd years. And so notable here, I think, is simply that quite a lot of young academics are not eating seafood at all. So this means that if we think of future transformation of aquaculture, we should not forget that maybe our initial assumptions, people will eat more fish in the future, maybe not the right one, but that we need to revisit and pay careful attention on what is going on in terms of preferences. And interestingly, then we also did then the semi-structured interviews with some of these people. And they, for example, very often said, we really like to consume salmon, but I know it's not a sustainable product, but I still like it. So apparently sustainability is not the only issue when you do a choice. And then we also asked these different groups, so the very informed aquaculture experts and then the young generation, if they would find that it is important to have an origin attachment, like produced in upper Monterey somewhere, or if they really want to have a regional label or not. And here again, there's a slight trend of young students to prefer that. And then we looked at in a more broader way. If we then asked on EU level, it was somewhat half-half, I would say. It is perceived as being important that people know where does my product come from. And for example, over 50% in Germany prefer products that are from their country, or even ideally even in the region, and only roughly 30% within the EU at least. And in Spain, it was completely the difference, that they said they didn't really care where it's come from, but they want, 11% said they don't mind being in the EU or not, but they were very much into the regionalization. And now your results. Remember, thanks very much again for including the survey. Here you see that as well. That either you don't seem to have such a strong regional preference, but because you're more knowledgeable, apparently you select more. It depends on the type of product. So just to show you that you're somewhat in between all of this, and apparently you've got some knowledge which sort of steers the way you respond to this. Then coming to the preferences of the seafood type, so whether it's processed, frozen, or fresh, and here you see as well that there's a strong link that people would like to have a fresh product, and followed by frozen, and also that salmon is quite preferred. And then that was the average for the European scale. But if you then look into more regional parts, then you see that there is the seafood preference species is quite different. For example, in Spain, over half states they want to have other products and not the sea bream, salmon, trout species, because they are much more, and I interpreted that Spain has a much more stronger marine culture and tradition, and is more knowledgeable on different types of species, while Germany and Poland are somewhat more landlocked and therefore are more narrow in their perception of what type of species they would like to consume. And then we asked how many, what would they rank their knowledge on aquaculture, so the consumers. And you see here again on the left-hand side, it was our own perceived ranking. And in orange, they are the young ones. The purple ones are the very young ones, so 14 to 18-year-olds. And the blue ones are the old guys, so 50 plus. And the old guys 50 plus were all the aquaculture specialists. So you see that range that the young students, so the very young ones, are very not very knowledgeable, or would say that they are not so, they don't feel very safe, let's say, with their knowledge. And then now coming then to the other part, so what is then the sustainability of farmed fish? And there we, interestingly enough, then that the very young students were a little bit more positive, while the academics, young academics from the ICMARA group, they were rather very negative. And now if we look then at you, so you're again somewhat, you're quite bold that you think you know quite a lot about seafood aquaculture. So why are you here? Apparently it's nice that you feel very knowledgeable. And I found it quite interesting that you also lean more to that fish farming is sustainable as well. This is just, you know, for among us, it's nothing special. I don't want to go into depth into this, but maybe last but not least, so what is then understanding the sustainability of seafood consumption? We heard a lot about seafood and sustainability over the last talks, and I deliberately changed the sustainability goals around here, and it's my favorite figure, even though it's maybe not the best because it doesn't really link nicely to the social dimensions. However, having said that, so basically the sustainability goals are here somewhat listed in layers, arguing that we need a solid biosphere to start with, and then that we then have the society laying on that biosphere, and from that all the economics and issues are developing, and across all we have some cooperation. And we then asked the very young students, so 14 to 18, what are the central buzzwords when we say we want to have sustainability, what they understand. Then you will see here a list of respondents collated. And maybe noteworthy is that a lot of these respondents deal with natural perspectives or ecological ones, like resources, protect, nature, balance. And that's somewhat interesting, and for me as a social scientist, somewhat frustrating, because apparently my natural science colleagues did a really good job over the last 20 years to advertise that sustainability has something to do with ecology. But so there's still some scope for improvement when we talk about sustainability in the social science perspective. So what is social sustainability? That's something really, really difficult. However, now that are your respondents, we were asking you then, so what do you think, or what would be important? And I found that quite intriguing, because I learned from Roberto that you all are trained aquaculture experts with more in the background natural science, and that you actually rank social welfare first. So apparently, you are already there on the right track to look on more social sustainability dimensions. And then as a second, you said it's an economic way, and the third one is an environmental, more sustainable. And then you had a lot of other arguments, and also put up more arguments, and I very much am grateful for all of you who participated in that, because I found it quite interesting to see that my hypothesis that social sustainability is somewhat understudied, so it's reinforced there. So the trend of tomorrow, just to wrap up, is that we can see that we surveyed over 500 young students between 14 and 18, and that there's apparently a rise of vegetarian, vegan lifestyles, and but also that we are observing, at least here in Europe, a lack of or a decline of lack of knowledge of how to deal actually with food. So a lot, like 50%, say that they rather prefer to have ready cooked meals, because they are unsure of how to handle the product. So main pathways then for the future. This is now the conclusion. I'm now on the final line, just so the contextual levels matter. So apparently we need to consider much more the different levels, from the individual actor to the national, and especially in regard if we want to change something. And then also regionality matters. So how far are you exposed to particular locations? Remember that I asked in the survey also if you would regard living very close to the coast or further away, because the closer you are to this marine system, the more familiar you get with it. And obviously then you also know much more about the role of the working waterfront and how does it affect well-being in a certain area. Maybe also when we want to move forward to more sustainable outcomes, we need to know who's actually engaged in the process and who's not engaged, and who's leading the change and why. That's something, we all have vested interests, and more often than not, I remember that very vividly from my research in Indonesia on ornamental trade dynamics, that men were talking completely different than women and children. And when you talk to children, very often you got then a quite good idea of how negotiation processes were happening in a different in a community. So it was quite interesting. And at the end, what does we need to think more closely on the impact? So what does aquaculture actually mean for the sustainability narrative, and who and what is affected and who not? And I think there's, at the moment, at least I can say that for here in Germany, that there's definitely a window of opportunity for more to foster eco-intensification of aquaculture, because COVID-19 has sort of reinforced and made more strongly aware of the vulnerability of our systems we're having right now. And it's thus fostering more global economy, a circular economy perspectives to mitigate the vulnerability we're facing right now. So before you go to your break, well deserved, I have three take-home messages, which are very dear to me, and I hope you can follow that. First, communicate. Communicate with the society. In every process, in every project, there are always drivers and stakeholders we know, and we are always there are matters we don't know. So coming to our donkey dilemma, we need to get people together. And I think this is really important there, that we know sometimes this classical no unknowns. Probably you have seen this figure before, so that you always have in a certain group of people, you always have the known knowns. So you know the stakeholders and you know how to target them. Then you have the known unknowns, like I know that there's somebody out there, but I don't know where he is. And then we have the unknown unknowns, that are our assumptions that we believe these stakeholder groups could be interested. And then there are known unknowns, which we have completely missed. And I think having that in mind, and then to keep humble with your efforts, I think that's a very, very central point. And I definitely would be very happy if you take that home with you. One. So now, then number two, take home number two. The societal relationships in a marine system. It's not only the environment, so it's the hardware. So meaning demography, infrastructure, the marine environment. But it's also a matter of how this is constructed and structured. So what type of planning process is there? What type of region responsibility? What type of legal framework? And now comes the tricky part, the very, very deep one. That's the culture one. We have certain attitudes, interests, values, and norms, and they sort of drive the entire thing. And we need to appreciate that, because it's sort of at the end of the day, no matter what we do, it's always a matter of giving a certain value to a matter. And if we are not aware of why do people give a certain value to something, then we can do whatever we want. We will not change or transform anything. So this is take home number two. Okay, and now the take home number three is looking at the social equity outcomes. Why am I stressing that? Because apparently I haven't mentioned social equity before. So here's my assumption then, that if we want to transform and we want to have more of the sustainability goals met, apparently it's a big task in terms of negotiating between all of us who gets what type of share and so forth. And that really relates to equity. So we need to sort of have a broader recognition that the individual expression and that I long to be recognized in a certain group or community, that this is actually a quite important step forward. Because I think we cannot simply say, well, you don't just want to do things like food and drink. But if we sit down and we eat and we drink together, it's not only about getting something into your stomach. It's much more. It's much more a culture that they want to, like when your mom cooks a nice dish, then it's not only saying, oh yeah, I've got rice, but yes, mom, great, you've got rice, and you put this in, and this is mother food. Yeah. So I think this is something we definitely need to be aware of, that we're quite complex people. Yeah, and to be that aware of that, and then to how to match that and how to link that in an equitable way, that's a really challenging one. So, and now I leave you for your well-deserved break. Thanks very much for listening. And some of you had the video and smiled, so it was not too bad, I hope.